All right, welcome back, or welcome for the first time, if this is indeed the first time you're clicking on my content or my face. Welcome and thank you to my most excellent sword friends, fellow sword enthusiasts, fellow martial artists, or for those of you who are joining for the first time because maybe you're thinking about getting into sword collecting or the martial arts associated with swords. Welcome and thank you. And while we're on the topic of thanks, this is an unexpected additional chapter in my series on tactical swords, which unofficially started when I picked up a pair of Apoc tactical butterfly swords. And I wasn't sure I was going to like them, and yeah, they were a little rough out of the box in certain ways, but once I did some fine-tuning to make them more comfortable to handle, they turned out to be pretty awesome. Awesome enough that it made me not only consider other Apoc products, but rethink my long-standing preference, especially when it comes to swords, of sticking to historic designs, not only for the aesthetics and collecting, but also for the way they handle in traditional practice. And I think I'd like these tactical, let's actually call them modern designs. One of my sword friends suggested I use the term modern instead of tactical, and I think that does suit them quite a bit. But looking into the Apoc line, I then picked up their Cutlass, and then I picked up the Broadsword. And in those previous reviews, I mentioned that, yeah, there's a couple of rough spots, a couple of things I can easily improve for my own tastes and handling preferences, but overall I was pretty impressed, and I was going to get to a side-by-side comparison video between the two of them. Now, there was this third sword in the Apoc line I had been looking at, but was very ambivalent to purchase. And again, I think that was, a lot of my old biases in my tastes for historical designs. And we're talking about, as you've seen in the title of the video, the Apoc Survival Katana. But watching my prior videos, my most excellent sword friend Andre decided to send me his first generation Apoc Survival Katana. Thank you so much, my friend, because despite my hesitancy, it turns out this sword, at least in my opinion, is awesome. Now, it does have a couple of rough spots, a couple of issues, and we'll talk about that, but yeah, I have to say, I am a lot more impressed with this than I thought I would be. So let's get into it. Okay, let's get the two big negatives out of the way. Sharp corners and scabbards. Now, when it comes to sharp corners, some of it's about the shaping, the finish of the G10 scales, and some of it's about any exposed metal edges, because we're talking about full tang construction, and they didn't do a lot of refinement once they cut the steel. It does leave some sharp edges, and if those edges are exposed in places where your hands get, yeah, can be very, very uncomfortable, even injurious. This was especially true of the butterfly swords, because there was sharp metal pretty much everywhere my hands went. So I needed to take the time to round off all those corners, file them down, polish them off, and then I reblued it to blend the finish back in together. Once I'd done that, I turned swords that were very unpleasant to even pick up into swords that are very, very comfortable to wield and cut with and take impact with and everything. So a good investment in time and effort. Now, the other models, it varies greatly between them, because the Cutlass, like the Katana we're going to look at, the G10 scales are very, very comfortably rounded out of the box. But those vestigial guard hooks, yeah, they have some sharp corners I had to round off. Now, your hand's not always colliding with them, depending on how you use and move and grip the sword, but it might, and it did on mine enough that I decided, yeah, I'll round some corners off. The Broadsword, on the other hand, I described as having G10 scales that were so square and sharp it felt like I was holding a piece of lumber, plus a lot of sharp corners on the pommel. Very uncomfortable to hold in my hand, but G10 is very workable as a material. Files, sandpaper, whatever, you can reshape it in some ways easier than you can reshape wood. And then a little bit of oil or whatever lubricant or preservative you use will restore the color if there's any color changes once you're done with that. Yeah, so I rounded off those corners, rounded off some of the corners on the pommel and on the guard, and yeah, just like the butterfly swords, the feel improved vastly. Now this sword is really, really comfortable in hand, and we'll get back to that. But let's talk about the scabbards. Okay, all the scabbards have the same general design. Now, I feel like the Cutlass and, well, the butterfly swords and the broadsword are newest generation. And I have heard that Dragon King Apoc has made some improvements since the first models came out in 2017, 2018, because there were a lot of complaints, and we're going to see, yeah, where those complaints came from. But in the latest generations, they all have the same kind of thin plastic scabbard with a drainage hole on the end, and then this sort of bracket here, call it a frog mounting or whatever, that is removable to certain degrees. Now, quick correction, I felt like on the broadsword, because there are rivets here instead of screws, like there are on the other models, I couldn't take this off. But Mike's eyes are getting worse, and he did not see the fact that there are really tiny, like eyeglass-sized screws embedded in the plastic on either side, so that's probably how you take this off. But this loop system also provides you retention in the way that these divots pinch into matching divots in the G10 scales. And retention out of the box is insane. It's a heck of a fight to get these swords out of the scabbard. The way you can fix that is by very, very carefully reshaping the hole in the G10 scale, specifically breaking the top corner and maybe reprofiling it just a little bit. But you just want to take a shave at a time, because you can't put it back once it's gone. So a little bit off, check the fit, a little bit off, check the fit, and you can adjust these to a point where it's just, well, perfect for you. Still gives you really good lock-in and retention, but you can get it out without a major struggle. Now, you heard that, well, not a little bit of plastic on metal scrape, but otherwise the fit of this sword into the scabbard is just pretty good. There's not a lot of rattle or anything or rub. But as I mentioned in the review of the Cutlass, I was getting some unpleasant scrape. The other thing to look at here is on those guard hooks, they're covered on the broadsword by, well, for lack of a better term, the lips at the top of the scabbard, so they're not exposed. Cutlass is one of the first designs. That and the Katana, the first designs that were put out, so those hooks are exposed. So consider that. Not a lot, but they're certainly sticking out there. It also changes the retention a little bit, because the way it fits in at the top versus having a flat scale, this one is a rounded scale. Adjustment was a little different, fits a little different. It doesn't click as positively, but it's still got a good positive lock. However, scrapey. The reason they're scrapey is because the curve of the blade and the curve of the scabbard are slightly different, so that the blade is rubbing right here. If I put some tension on it, yeah, it changes the sound of that quite a bit. So what I'm thinking I'm going to need to do is carefully apply maybe some heat to see if I can reshape the curvature of the scabbard, and that might improve that a lot. But still, not a lot of rattle. That's good. But again, I'm thinking these are most current generation. What Andre sent me was first generation, and I can't even move it without, yeah. Okay, we're certainly not going for stealth here when it comes to tactical sword. Even though it's a very slim scabbard, everything else same, except there's a little bit more exposure in this hook. There's a little bit more space in here, but I might be able to put that to some good use. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I feel like I can stick 3 of these blades in the same scabbard, and that's, as we'll see, is the blade on this sword is very slender. But yeah, I'm gonna have to either replace the scabbard or figure out some kind of lining system, because that is just crazy making. But that doesn't mean the scabbard doesn't have potential, and we'll take a look at that in handling. let's talk about the good. Okay, a little bit of sharpness testing. And I'll do some side-by-side performance comparisons, but let's do the old paper cut. It's pretty good. How about a little handy cardboard? Yeah, that's retained a really good edge. Now, Andre told me that he'd been basically whacking stuff in his backyard, you know, hacking grass and plants and stuff like that, using it like a machete in many ways. And he's had it probably 4 or 5 years. And despite all that, it's in fantastic shape. The edge is perfect. Okay, backing up to give you the full-length view, and then I'll show you close-up shots as we talk. Talk about the specs and all of the good. There's a lot of good about this sword, so this might run a little bit long. And then we'll do some handling. But right up front, first time I held this sword in my hand, I was blown away. This was not at all how I expected it to be in many, many good ways. So let's get into that. But again, this may not be representative of what you're going to buy off the shelf today. There may have been some changes made from the first generation. And looking at the specs that I'm seeing on current websites like Cult of Athena and SBG don't quite match what I've got in hand. I don't have one of those to compare it to. Maybe one day I'll buy one, because if a newer generation was an improvement on this one, I'd be intrigued. So if you happen to have a newer one, you can tell me about yours. We'll get our conversation going in the comments. But what do I have in hand that impressed me so much? All right, you got a 25.5-inch blade if you measure from the guard hook. So if I was to put a habaki there and measure Nagasa, take an inch off that or so you're talking about 24.5-inch blade. Yes, that would be about 3 inches or so shorter than a modern reproduction Uchi-Katana that you would get today, but it's not out of spec with historic examples of Edo period swords. It might be shorter for carry and quick draw. So that's not bad. And we'll talk about grip here in a second in terms of grip position. Speaking of grip, you do get a full 11-inch set of handle scales. Just like all the other Apoc offerings, you've got a 9260 spring steel blade, G10 scales that have those 3 bolts that retain them, those 3 hex bolts, and yeah, there's a lanyard hole at the end, full tan construction. Now this one, like the Cutlass, has what they call an oxide coating, or maybe it's a phosphate coating specifically, very similar to parkerization. Now Andre said he did kind of use this like a machete in the backyard, wound up gunking it up a lot, cleaning it off a lot. He was still getting it to shed some of that brown oxide residue, and he was kind of worried about sending it to me like that. When I got it, I went ahead and took my 3M pads to it, buffed it a bit. Yeah, very much like a parkerized finish. It's held up really well. Despite whatever he did to it and with it, there's no damage to the edge, no damage to the finish or the surface. It looks like new. So that's saying something. Now, as you saw in the edge test, yeah, it has retained a really good edge. The secondary bevel it's really keen. I expect it to cut really well. But where it gets interesting, weight and balance. Now, 2 pounds, 4 ounces is the weight that I'm used to with a lot of my reproduction Uchi-Katana. Point of balance on the websites for the newest generation will speak of something around 4 inches, maybe 3.5 or something like that, which again is what I would expect with a modern reproduction Uchi-Katana. This model, however, is sitting at 1/2 inch, barely north of the guard at all. Now I will do a video where I talk about balance and its effect on the handling of a weapon. But because of the point of balance on this thing, if I was looking for basically something that handled like a lightsaber, but I still had steel in my hand, this would be it. Now, a lot of that, I think, is because of the blade profile. you have profile and distal taper. So it starts at about 1 1/8 wide and winds up being about 3/4 of an inch down here, 1/4 of an inch thick through the tang, but then by the time it gets to the tip, it drops down to half of that, 1/8 of an inch. Also in the plane construction, it's not a true Shinogi Zukiri with perfectly flat parallel side planes. They taper towards the spine just a little bit. Not a full diamond construction, but there is some relief in there, and you can kind of see a little bit of a cut here at the base of it by the ricasso. That also probably takes some weight off this blade. So that gives you a blade that handles like air, but you can still feel it. I still have really good feel for it, and we'll see how it does in cutting. I mean, I certainly have a lot of mass down here and a lot of authority, but yeah. All right. The grip scales, everything is super even and smooth. I did round off the hooks a little bit. We'll see where my hand might run into that. But, okay, let's talk handling. All right, before this gets too long, let's talk about handling and potential, starting with this rather horrible scabbard, which still has potential. Now, obviously, rattle, 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 but an interesting thing about the design of having this fixture on the Apoc swords is I can slide it into an obi out of the box, and it gives me some retention. It's not going to fall through the back of my belt, and that's a good thing. I could certainly rig up some kind of unconventional, non-traditional Sageo system for additional retention if I wanted to, but it also allows me to, slide it in and out to do Sayabiki and stuff like that in drawing. Speaking of which, obviously the rattle is not at all aesthetically pleasing, nor does it give me a very good feel. However, some potential. I did have to alter the retention tension by adjusting the G10 scales fit a little bit. Andre had this sword for years, but when I got it, it was still ridiculously tight. Had to really struggle to draw it. Got it to the point where it still gives me good retention. It's not going to just drop out, but I can break the seal to do a draw without a big struggle. And I could do it in a couple of ways. I could certainly just tug on it with a decent amount of momentum and it'll come free. But traditionally speaking, semi-traditionally speaking, I could use my left thumb like I would against the Suba of a more traditional sword and break that seal. Now I did have to round those edges in there because that would otherwise cut me. And I may do some changes to the relief gap in here, so I can do that a little bit easier. Don't know yet, but I can do that. I can also use my right thumb, a little less conventionally, to push against the bottom edge of the scabbard, like I would break the seal on like a cold steel Securec sheath, so I can do that. But either way, it allows me to break the seal and draw the sword without too much of an awkward struggle. Then, given the weight and the blade length of the sword, what you wind up with is an almost effortless lightning draw that is also fairly safe for Mike to do inside without destroying stuff. So, more practice opportunity, especially if I'm experimenting with less familiar techniques. Also, the feed lip orientation on this scabbard actually assists in doing no-toe. Now, not only does it help with the feed, I've also got a big oval hole to slide the blade into. It's a lot harder to miss or snag, so it's a lot more forgiving of slop, which may be appealing to a beginner. On the other hand, you could say it could develop some sloppy practice not to work with a traditional saya. Now there is, however, a snag point in there because you've got the tube of the scabbard and then the extra fitting on the outside here does leave a shelf on the inside. So if I'm not really careful, I could snag it. You could catch like right there and wedge in between those two plastic pieces. But otherwise, it's easy to draw. It's easy to resheath with a little bit of adjustment. Is it pleasing to do so? No. It works, but yeah, I'm going to have to do something about this. Either replace it, line it, I don't know. To be continued. Okay, let's get rid of that and talk about the awesomeness of the blade. The handling of the blade, because of weight, even though it's a full weight sword in my mind at 2 pounds 4 ounces, it's the weight of a lot of the other Uchi katana I like, but because the point of balance is so close to my hand, yeah, closest thing to a lightsaber and still be steel that I can kind of imagine. And I can wield it freely with one or two hands. I also, like the Cutlass and the Broadsword, have some choices on grip. Now, when I'm drawing, I tend to naturally index to a Fuchi or a Suba. So I did have to round these hooks a little bit because in certain kinds of actions it was digging into my fingers. Did a little rounding here, but I don't have to hold it here. If I choke down, that lengthens the blade but also shifts that point of balance out to something that does indeed make it feel pretty much exactly like my other Uchigatana or Gunto in this weight range. So I've got that back and I still have enough grip left that I can put that second hand on it. Which are a little closer together, but I like a shorter Suka anyway. So it's got that potential. But more than that, I've talked about some of the experiments I've got in the works. One is things that might be a little bit more abusive. I wouldn't want to put some of my nicer swords to. I'd be afraid of functional damage or even cosmetic damage. Something like this I'm not going to worry about. And considering what Andre's apparently already done to it, it's held up pretty well. I have no doubts it can handle a little or a lot of hard use. So consider that. If you want a sword you can really beat up and beat on, something like this could be your thing. But my other big experiment, which I've already kind of introduced to you in a few other videos, including my recent video on rethinking Shibori, is as I am comparing, contrasting, cross-training my, well, familiarity with traditional Japanese and Chinese swordsmanship to what I've been studying most recently in the last few years, different styles, masters, weapons of HEMA. I can certainly wield this in the traditional style. That's not a problem. Or one-handed, there are one-handed styles of Japanese swordsmanship, absolutely, that this could be wielded in very, very easily. But other weapons that I've studied, similar length, balance, again, the balance and the weight and length is adjustable depending on where I grab it. Look what I just did. I naturally put my thumb on the back of it in what might be recognized as saber grip, and it feels great and moves great. So as I'm cross-training things like side sword or saber or backsword or broadsword, I can use this weapon to do all of those things very nicely and then go back and forth and transition. And this cross-study, as I've already mentioned in other videos, has given me unexpectedly deep insight into my traditional practices of Japanese and Chinese swordsmanship. It's upped my game, my skill level, my understanding immensely by studying some of these other systems. Plus, bringing that knowledge into my studies of HEMA gives it a whole different depth. Now, I'm talking about a one-handed weapon in some of those HEMA systems. Well, what about something in the offhand? Would this work with a buckler? Would it work with a dagger or something like that? Absolutely. Would it work with another kind of sword? Well, conveniently, I've got the Cutlass, which is bigger and heavier than the average wakizashi, but let me tell you, these guys make an interesting team. And I do tend to do some videos on dual wielding, which will specifically reflect back on my early experience with, yes, dual wielding in traditional Japanese style swordsmanship, which when I carry that into dual wielding in HEMA, yeah, the depth of insight in the practice, yeah, really, really upping my game, my understanding, my skill level in ways that I'd never imagined before. So all good, and this is a great tool to add into that conversation. Absolutely. So thank you, Andre. This was a wonderful, useful gift that's going to get, yeah, it's going to get a lot of work. It's going to be in my hands a lot. And you'll see that in future installments. So my next installment is I'm going to go ahead and go outside and do some side-by-side cutting. It was going to be just the Cutlass and the Broadsword. Now this one's going to be included in it so you can see some comparative performance and some other experiments, and then we'll get on to some of those cross arts or some more of those cross arts demonstrations Until then, as always, thank you everyone for watching, following, subscribing, liking the videos, getting our conversation going, adding to that conversation in the comments. Do you have this sword? Do you have similar swords? Do you have any questions about these? Anything I can hopefully answer? Any ideas you've got for future videos? I love those. And then I hope to see you back for, well, the next installment.